On December 15th, 1745, snow falls outside the city of Dresden. On one side, a Saxon army is desperate to defend their capital and hoping that their allies, the Austrians, will show up at any minute with reinforcements. On the other side, Prussians, commanded by the Old Dessauer or Leopold I. You might remember him from our top commanders bracket a few months ago. At 69 years old, he's a relic of the past Prussian monarch, and currently he's actively feuding with Frederick II. But in the winter of 1745, he's about to launch a frontal assault that could effectively end the Second Silesian War. Today, we're looking at the Battle of Kesselsdorf. Kesselsdorf is one of the lesser known and often overshadowed battles of this period. But historian and author Dr. Alex Querengässer argues it's actually one of the most decisive and underrepresented battles of the entire 18th century. Today, Alex Burns is going to be walking us through the battle step by snowy step, and we'll look at why it's an almost entirely Saxon fight and how their supply lines dictate their strategy, the toxic command tension between Leopold I and Frederick the Great, and the trap the Prussians used to lure Saxon troops out of their strong positions and crush them. I'm Lee Gugino, joined by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Thank you for joining us for the Battle of Kesselsdorf. Alex, you want to just kind of start off briefly with kind of orienting us to the situation? What's the war about? How do we get to this point where these two armies are in general fighting in Europe?
Absolutely. So again, for listeners who've kind of been following along through some of these episodes, we've been going through some of the major battles of the War of Austrian Succession, or sometimes you see it called the Second Silesian War. But this is a fight between powers in Central Europe who are basically trying to reorder the territory controlled and the nature of alliances and maybe the level of great power relationships in Central Europe in the 1740s. And so here we're in 1745. This summer we talked about the Battle of Hohenfriedeburg. This fall we talked about the Battle of Soor, and now we're at the last major battle, at least of the Prussian involvement of the Second Silesian War, or War of Austrian Succession, and that is the Battle of Kesselsdorf on December 15th, 1745. And so just for a more kind of local context, basically what's happening here is it's a kind of a three-way battle in some ways. There are, if you think of just kind of German geography generally, or Central European geography generally, you have Prussia, which is a North German Protestant state that is fighting against Austria, which is a sort of South German Catholic state. And in between the two of them, you have a smaller, though really not smaller is not exactly fair. And one of the things that Alex Querengässer tries to do in his book is argue that it really, in many ways, Saxony is about as viable as Prussia as a great power up until this period. But Saxony is kind of stuck in between. And so they start the war allied with the Prussians, kind of attacking the Austrians, attacking the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa in the First Silesian War in 1741 and 1742. But after that First Silesian War ends and the Prussians drop out of the war briefly, the Saxons are pretty frustrated by the level of their gains, by sort of what they got at the peace settlement. And so they decide to sort of switch sides and join the Habsburgs or the Austrians for the second round, or the Second Silesian War. And so the Prussian army has gone from kind of fighting against the Austrians with a host of allies to fighting against both the Austrian army and, as we've seen in the podcast this summer and fall, there were usually a Saxon contingent of the Austrian armies that are fighting against the Prussians, for example, at Hohenfriedeburg and at Soor. And today at Kesselsdorf, we're going to see that relationship is still there, but it's almost in reverse. This is a Saxon army with an Austrian kind of allied contingent that's trying to fight against a Prussian army.
And when you're talking about the switch of Saxony from allying with Prussia to Austria, it's that it's not being able to get that area of Silesia that makes them upset, that they would have rather had a larger connected state, but they didn't get it, and that's what caused them to kind of swap sides.
Sure, I think that's an immediate cause, but I think also it's just the larger sort of question of, for much of the 17th century, Austria had seemed kind of like the big giant boogeyman that kind of dominated Saxon nightmares. Like, we're worried about, what Austria is our giant neighbor. Do they have kind of belligerent intentions against us? I mean, if you look at the 30 Years' War, there are a lot of large battles in the 30 Years' War fought and in Saxony. It's kind of like a natural sort of movement point between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. So the Austrians seem pretty scary. But in the wake of the First Silesian War, the Saxon government decides, man, we got a new problem. That new problem is Prussia. We've got to do something to kind of curb the expansive tendencies of this Prussian state under Frederick II and Frederick the Great, or we're not going to be on the map. Indeed, if you read Frederick's political testaments, and I'm not trying to knock on Frederick the Great, I think I'm one of Frederick the Great's principal defenders online in a sea of people who don't like him very much anymore. But if you look at Frederick the Great's political testaments, he's pretty clear, like, yeah, Saxony would be great if we could pick that up. That'd be amazing. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely Saxony is like increasingly it looks like a pretty small fish in a sea of sharks that kind of surround it, and it's trying to sort of find a return to the stability that it had enjoyed in the 17th century, and they hope by allying with Austria they'll be able to do that.
And so when we talk about the Second Silesian War, just as an overview, it's the second round to a war that had already happened over the resources of Silesia. Is that a fair kind of maybe too simplistic overview?
No, that's 100% what's going on. I would say basically it's all part of the big War of Austrian Succession. So there's a big like World War II-esque war going on right now, and it's kind of more on the level of like Italy switches sides halfway through World War II. Well, Saxony switches sides halfway through the Silesian Wars or the War of Austrian Succession. We just have this distinction of the First and Second Silesian Wars because it's almost like in the middle of the war, Prussia takes a pause. They drop out of the war for a minute and they rejoin. And so in German and particularly Prussian historiography, it's very common to call these the First, Second, and also Third Silesian War. That's the 7 Years' War. Whereas in English historiography, we usually just say, this is the War of Austrian Succession. This is the 7 Years' War.
Awesome. And so when we look at a strategic level, you mentioned before that this is kind of the third iteration of battles in a series of in a campaign. Can you briefly kind of remind us where we started and how we got to this point at Kesselsdorf?
Sure, absolutely. So for much of 1744 and 1745, early 1745, it looks like the Prussians are kind of losing this war. Frederick the Great tries to invade Bohemia, which is what we would today call the Czech Republic or Czechia, and his army is not defeated in a major battle, but it does waste away as a result of disease and sort of bad weather and desertion. You invade a territory in the winter, and it's not a ton of fun for the soldiers, so they tend to go looking for food and things like this. And so, as a result, he withdraws with kind of like the remains of his army back into Silesia, trying to rebuild his army. The Austrians think they got him on the ropes. They invade Silesia in the summer of, the spring of 1745. This leads to a major battle, the Battle of Hohenfriedberg, that we talked about. Listeners, go check out that podcast from earlier in the year. And it's a major victory for the Prussians over their Austrian and Saxon opponents. They are able to sort of go out and smash a pretty large Austrian and Saxon combined allied army. Frederick then goes on the offensive, trying to basically like destroy stores and acquire sort of provisions into just south of Silesia, kind of just over the border into the Austrian-controlled territory. The Austrians then, late in September, show up and launch a surprise attack on his army. The very last second, he gets wind of this surprise attack, mobilizes his forces, launches an attack on them. This leads to the Battle of Soor. The Battle of Soor is, in many ways, like the crisis point for Frederick during the Silesian Wars. His army could have been absolutely destroyed. He manages to get out of this with a win. After this, he kind of returns into Silesia, and the goal then becomes to try to knock out Austria's subordinate power, sort of their ally in the region, Saxony. And so the fighting shifts from fighting down in Bohemia, fighting over Silesia, to trying to sort of invade and actually kind of decisively knock the Saxons out of this war. And so Frederick is kind of mobilizing an army from two directions. He's got a Prussian army under a subordinate general, a guy who's going to feature prominently on our story today, named Leopold von Old Dessauer, who's coming out of the neighborhood of Halle, kind of from the northwest, basically invading Saxony from the northwest. And we'll have for the listeners both a map of the battle today and also a kind of a map of the overall strategic situation, so you can kind of chart these movements. But Frederick himself is invading sort of Saxony from the east. He's coming over from Silesia. And so for the Saxons and their Austrian allies, it's almost kind of like our relatively small countries being caught in a pincer movement between two larger, or not larger, but two Prussian armies is pretty serious. And so the Saxon government, Count von Brühl is sending, messages to the Austrians. Hey, could you send the army up from Bohemia and like help us out a bit? We have an army, kind of in the area defending our capital city, but it's only the size of one of these Prussian armies, not the size of both of these Prussian armies. So in order to survive, we're going to need some assistance. And of course, it's going to be no one's top choice for 18th century commander, Prince Charles of Lorraine, who is commanding these forces that are coming up from Cheshire, coming up from Bohemia to try and reinforce the Saxon position near their capital city of, English would say Dresden, or Dresden in German. So you have, basically imagine like the McClellan of 18th century warfare kind of commanding your relief army. This is not exactly an exciting moment for the Saxons. They're sending a lot of messages to the Austrian army, like, can you guys hurry up? They're really coming for us. Please get that relief army up to Dresden. That would be wonderful. So it's a very tense moment in late November and early December 1745 in Saxony, as these Prussian armies are converging, and the Saxons are trying to sort of make preparations and assemble their forces to defend their capital city, and they're hopeful that the Austrians will come up and support them.
And can you started to briefly talk about the geography and the layout of this battle, or leading up to this battle. Can you kind of dig into that a little bit more, kind of give us a 1,000-foot view, and then bring us down to the actual ground that we're going to be fighting on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want you to picture Saxony as just imagine a country bordered on the south by mountains, with a river flowing from the southeast to the northwest, the Elbe kind of bisecting the country. And in some ways, like the Elbe is what makes Saxony great. You have a lot of river trade. It's where a lot of the sort of most prosperous cities in Saxony are kind of centered on the Elbe, cities like Dresden, cities like Meissen. But it creates some sort of interesting challenges if you're trying to conduct military operations because there's a large river bisecting the country, right? And so, to a large extent, you frequently you don't try to cross the Elbe in front of enemy forces. You have troops on, the western bank of the Elbe and troops on the eastern bank of the Elbe, and you're trying to kind of hold on to the cities, which are in some ways like the points where you can easily cross, because there are either pontoon or actual stone bridges that cross the Elbe at these points. And so for the Saxons, kind of looking at this situation, they're being invaded by a Prussian army that's coming out of the northwest. They're also being invaded by the Prussian army under the king, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, coming out of Silesia, coming out of the sort of the east. It might seem to us like, wow, you should really be worried about where Frederick the Great is, because like he's kind of the big general that everyone's heard about, from the 18th century. In many ways, the army coming out of Halle, commanded by Leopold von Anhalt-Dessau, is the larger threat because it's on the same side as the Elbe as the main Saxon army. And so they think, well, we can kind of worry about Frederick down the line, but the army under the command of this sort of Prussian nobleman who is coming down directly on the same side of the river we're on is actually the immediate threat that we need to be most laser focused on, most worried about. And so, again, think about that larger strategic picture, bordered in the south by mountains, cut in half, sort of northwest to southeast by a large river, some cities on that river. One of those principal cities is Dresden. It's the capital city of Saxony. And so if you zoom in, they're closer to Saxony, or closer to Dresden, the capital city. It kind of looks like the same landscape I've just described, but in microcosm. And so there, again, the principal geographical feature is the Elbe. You're sort of anchoring one of the flanks of your army. In the case of the Austrians and the Saxons, really, I guess the Saxons and the Austrians, they're anchoring their right flank or their eastern flank of their army on the Elbe River, trying to sort of create a cordon that's going to defend Dresden from attacks from the northwest, from this Prussian army. And so, if you look at maps of the campaign, basically the Prussian army is slowly, kind of eventually getting its own army to the Elbe and then working its way down the Elbe River towards Dresden. And the Saxons are trying to come up with a good defensive position in between the Prussian army and the city of Dresden. It's a challenging, thing to do, especially in December. The campaigning season is usually kind of completed by this point. The armies are getting ready to go into winter quarters. Frederick is trying to kind of pull out a win at the very last moment in the year, and so he's creating challenges both for his own forces and for the Saxons. But let's talk a little bit about the battle level geography, kind of the actual battlefield at Kesselsdorf, because like most of these battles, it's named after a village near the battlefield, the village of Kesselsdorf. So again, if you have that picture in your mind, if the Elbe is this sort of line that runs diagonally northwest to southeast, the kind of like Washington at Brandywine, there are several creeks, I guess we would say in English, or smaller rivers that flow into the Elbe that kind of bisect the terrain. And so they create a series of valleys or marshy ravines. Ravines is probably a little bit too strong. It's not like they're sheer cliffs or something like this. But difficult ground that's a bit marshy that would be hard for an army to cross. One of these is called the Schönegrund. And basically it is a valley that runs into the Elbe that the Prussians have to cross coming down towards this capital city at Dresden. So again, if you're point of reference is the American Revolution. Think of the Battle of Brandywine. Battle of Brandywine Creek kind of shields the city of Philadelphia. Washington thinks, I'm going to sort of defend this geographical strong point that enables me to slow down the British Army, prevent them from getting to Philadelphia. Well, kind of like, I guess, in reverse geographically, because the enemy's coming up from the northwest. You have the Saxon commander, Count Ratovsky, who's thinking, wow, the Schöner Ground gives me kind of like a defensible line that I can use to sort of center my army on to try and slow down, delay, maybe stop the Prussian advance towards Dresden. That will enable me to maybe hold out. The Prussians will decide, we can't actually bag the city in a winter campaign. They'll go into winter quarters. The campaign will end. Likewise, if you just hold on and slow down the Prussians for a few days, hopefully Prince Charles of Lorraine will appear with a big reinforcement army of Austrians. And so you're kind of playing for time. And in Count Ratovsky's mind, it's the Schöner Ground that kind of gives this opportunity for the Saxons to do this. Now, looking at the battlefield, it's a battlefield of sort of plains and rolling hills on either side of the Schöner Ground. There are other sort of ravines that sort of bisect the battlefield, maybe a little bit smaller in different ways. But there are some principal villages that the Saxons are trying to defend. The furthest point that they try to defend to the west, so imagine in some ways like a line stretching from this point all the way back to the Elbe, is the village of Kesselsdorf. It's a village with, sort of surrounded by agricultural terrain, with fences and hedges. They think we're going to sort of fortify this as a strong point, put a lot of artillery here to command our left flank, and then this will be an anchor, just like the Elbe is an anchor on the right end of our line. So we can have kind of two solid anchors that our line stretches between. Well, the trouble is, it's a really long distance. We're talking about number of miles. And so as a result, the big question for the Austrian forces, or the Saxon forces, excuse me, there are some Austrians there too, but they're the minority. The big question for the Saxon forces is, what will happen? Where exactly will the attack come? Where does the bulk of our defensive army need to be deployed, kind of in this line between Kesselsdorf and the Elbe? And so for a couple of days before December 15th, as Prince Leopold and the Prussians are kind of working their way down the Elbe towards the enemy, or towards the Saxon position, the Saxons are trying to figure where exactly should our army be deployed. And so the Saxon army, like you would think, well, man, they're just kind of trying to defend. Usually the defender's pretty stationary. Increasingly, the Saxon commander is ordering his forces to kind of march back and forth. He doesn't know exactly which road that the Prussians are coming down. So it's kind of a crisis point for the Saxons. For several days, even though they're kind of in a fairly static defensive position, they've been shuffling back and forth, concentrating their forces at different points at this defensive position. And so they are worn out. They don't have their tents with them. And it's snowy weather. It's snow, and it's been a very strong kind of like freeze, and so it's almost like a very solid layer of snow, or like an icy layer is developed on the battlefield. And also the Saxon forces have not had anything to eat for like 24 hours. And so it is not a great, we might think in a winter campaign where the enemy is in a defensive position and your forces are on the attack, you're at a disadvantage because your guys are moving. It's not as easy to resupply your army on the move. In many ways, it's actually kind of the Saxons who are worn out. I mean, imagine, basically like lying down on the ice trying to get a couple hours of sleep as you're kind of shuffling between different positions. You haven't had anything to eat for a couple days. It's a real sort of difficult position to be in for these Saxon soldiers. It's not just what people who really love Prussia, sort of like to assume is like, the Saxons aren't good at fighting like the Prussians. Like their army is faced with a number of severe disadvantages, sort of in terms of morale, in terms of the soldiers' energy, as they come into this battle, because of the weather, because of the geographic position and kind of the terrain that they're in.
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative, it's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
Can you talk to us about the commander in charge of these Saxon forces? Who is he, and what's his story, very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Friedrich August Rutowski. He is, like so many Polish noblemen in the 1740s, an illegitimate son of the previous king, a man named August the Strong, or Augustus the Strong, and he with a lot of military experience. He's been in the army since the 17 teens. He's fought in the War of Polish Succession, both in Poland and on the Rhine. And so he's not someone who has no military experience. He doesn't have a great number of kind of battles that he's personally commanded in his repertoire that he can draw on. Usually, in a lot of these fights in the War of Austrian Succession, because Saxony is a slightly smaller state, a slightly smaller army, they're subordinate to somebody else, usually the Austrians. And so it's an Austrian who's in high command, and the Saxons are almost like a subordinate wing of that army. Well, here, there are only a couple Austrians. They've got like one grenadier battalion and some cuirassiers. There are some Warsteiner Croats, who I'm sure are having a lovely time looting a village somewhere. And then that's pretty much it. The main Austrian army is still coming up, basically from the south, from Bohemia. They're getting close, and Rutowski is doing his diligence to ensure that there are no impediments to their march. He's clearing the roads. He actually sends messages saying, like, I'm leaving some of my supply wagons so your soldiers can loot them, so they will be more motivated to march quickly, which is like the ultimate sacrifice on the part of a general, giving away your supplies to an allied army. He's trying to, I think, do the best that he can, as someone who maybe doesn't have a huge amount of army command experience. And he does. I don't think necessarily he's at fault for, spoilers, what goes wrong for the Saxons here at Kesselsdorf.
And can we take a look at the Prussian forces? We've already talked a whole lot about Prussian forces in our other episodes, but kind of what's the force look like, and who are the two commanders? We've touched on them briefly in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So Frederick's not even here, so I'm gonna sort of completely avoid talking about him. Maybe we'll reference it a little bit, but the commander here is a guy who in German is frequently called the Old Dessauer, or like the old man from Dessau, or the Old Dessauer. Basically, he's, as the name suggests, getting older at this point. His heyday was in many ways like the War of Spanish Succession in Italy. He fights alongside Prince Eugene of Savoy in those campaigns, and Prince Leopold von Anhalt-Dessau, is a favorite of Frederick's father. And if you know anything about Prussian history in this period, you know that father and son didn't get along super well. And so when the old king dies, the big question mark over a lot of Prussian ministers and generals' heads is, man, I was buddy-buddy with the dad, but the son hated the dad, so what's the son going to do to me? And I think to some extent it's a credit of, to Prince Leopold as a commander that he's able to sort of stay in place. He is one of the principal Prussian subordinates all throughout the War of Austrian Succession. At battles like the Battle of Kesselsdorf in the First Silesian War, or the earlier part of the War of Austrian Succession, he's commanding wings of the army that are engaging the enemy independently. So you know that kind of Frederick has some trust, or some trust at least, in him as a subordinate commander who can kind of do his own thing independently. Their relationship is kind of falling off in some ways as you get into the 1745 campaign, and especially in this winter campaign. All is not happy. Unity of command is not so totally evident in between these two forces. Basically, Frederick is sending Leopold a whole bunch of pretty rude, if we're being honest. I mean, Frederick's a pretty rude guy. I mean, I'll defend his abilities, but I'm not trying to say he's some sort of saint. He's sending Leopold a whole bunch of messages saying, you're dawdling, you're being really slow, the enemy's getting away, you're not doing a good job as commander, you need to go and be aggressive and do your job. And Leopold is, a Prussian nobleman of a certain generation, takes this as pretty offensive, because it is, and basically, says, well, I guess I need to resign if you don't like me, and is in some ways looking at this battle as a way of maybe trying to justify his actions up until this point in the campaign, kind of justify his reputation. He and the king don't really get along, or at least they're not getting along at this moment in the campaign, and certainly if the battle had gone differently, I think there would be, especially among people who love Frederick, there would be a very different kind of narrative about Leopold von Anhalt-Dessau in the Prussian army and in Prussian military history. But his honor has certainly kind of been slighted by his king's comments. I'll read you one of them. I cannot deny that I am very greatly satisfied with your Serene Highness's maneuvers, and this is the weird part of the 18th century. You got a king calling another prince your Serene Highness, that's what's going on. You are going so slowly, as if you had set out to put me at a disadvantage. So Frederick is you're dawdling, and you're dawdling so badly that it's going to make my job harder. And so this is pretty sort of strong stuff. Leopold, I think, feels like he's kind of got to justify himself, justify his reputation and his honor in the course of fighting this battle at Kesselsdorf. Now, Prussian army, a little smaller than the Saxon army, about 30,000 soldiers. Again, you got cavalry, cuirassiers, dragoons, hussars. You've got infantry, mostly musketeers and grenadiers in this case. Frederick has this, I don't know, I want to totally throw him under the bus, but Frederick has this nasty habit of taking all the best troops and putting them in his army and giving all of his subordinate commanders kind of the B team. This is not totally true at Kesselsdorf. For example, listeners from the summer and people who love Prussian military history generally will remember the Bayreuth Dragoons at the Battle of Hohenfriedeburg, the guys who kind of led this charge that cracked open the enemy line. Well, they're actually in Leopold's army, so not all of his soldiers are the B team. He probably has some of the best cavalry soldiers in the army, or at least the cavalrymen who currently have the highest reputation are in the army. But if you look at kind of the proportion of grenadiers in Leopold's army versus Frederick's army, Frederick is absolutely husbanding some of the best assault troops for himself and maybe not giving them to Prince Leopold von Anhalt-Dessau.
Okay. And now that we're kind of honing down to the tactical level, Could you kind of give us a concise mission statement for each commander? What are each of them trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so Rutowski is basically just trying to like white knuckle and hang on until the Austrians arrive, or the Prussians decide, this defensive position is too strong, we're not going to actually do a winter campaign. Whereas Prince Leopold is basically like, I got to crack through to Dresden and end the war. Trying to crush the Saxon army, seize the enemy capital. The hope is this is going to be like a 1-2 punch that will knock Saxony out of this war.
Awesome. And so, the battle.
Sure.
What happens? The big question.
It's a great question. Who can say? No, in all seriousness, the Prussians are on the road themselves. So we talked about how exhausted the Saxons are from their repeated kind of like counter marches and repositioning. The Prussians are also kind of marching most of the day on December 15th. They only arrive on the battlefield and are ready to begin the attack by about 2 p.m., which is pretty late in the day. I mean, imagine American listeners, imagine like Longstreet at the second day of Gettysburg, right? I mean, the assault begins late in the day. You don't have much time in order to sort of complete this. And like, that's July. This is Northern Europe in December. You got like a couple hours of daylight left when the attack begins. And so in many ways, the deployments of the two armies kind of, but don't exactly mirror each other. The Prussian deployment is bog standard for the 18th century. That is to say, you have infantry forces in the middle of the army, and you've got cavalry forces on the wings. Leopold chooses the best regiments in his army, which are his grenadiers, and a particularly strong regiment, the Anhalt regiment, which is viewed in the Prussian army as being like the best musketeer regiment in the army because it's Prince Leopold's. He puts those in like an assault force or an advance guard that are tasked with going and assaulting the enemy-held sort of village of Kesselsdorf. As I've kind of already alluded to, the Saxon deployment is a little different. They have a huge battery of cannons in front of the village of Kesselsdorf. They have grenadiers holding defensive positions along hedges and walls and in buildings all throughout this village. Although, oddly enough, and this is something I did not know until I read Alex Querengässer's book, that they don't actually take the walled churchyard on the southern end of the village like a fallback point. They kind of leave that empty. From the sort of there, you have infantry and artillery at the end of your line. There are a few kind of like Polish lancers south of the village of Kesselsdorf trying to be the ultimate flank guard. Going further towards the Elbe, off to the east, down the Saxon line, the next folks who are in line are actually cavalry, chevaux légers, which are all kind of like dragoons or like lighter cavalrymen that are still fighting in a battle. And then the rest of the Saxon army is deployed. There are guns in the front or artillery pieces in the front, infantry deployed in two lines. The first line is complete. The second line is kind of like in intervals. They don't have enough infantry to completely sort of fill in the second line. And then a cavalry line behind these two lines of infantry. This stretches down from Kesselsdorf, down that sort of Schönegrund ravine to the next village, the village of Zulmen. There's another village, the village of Penrick, kind of going down towards the Elbe. And then much further, there's a significant gap, but much, much further, sort of right close to the Elbe itself, there are a series of actual Austrian units, or in this case, a lot of them are Hungarians, that are right on the Elbe River and right next to the Elbe River, trying to defend in case the Prussians at the last minute are going to swing in this direction. And so these forces, some Croats, some Varsteiner Croats, some Hungarians of the Betlen regiment, they are trying to defend close to the river while the main Saxon army defends near Kesselsdorf. And Prince Leopold's principal attack, obviously, is going to come towards this main Saxon army. A lot of these Austrian or Hungarian infantrymen are going to miss the battle up near the Elbe.
And we've got the Prussians, they're formed and they're moving towards the attack, towards this Saxon army.
Exactly right. So the first thing that they do is they get to basically the place, like most ravines, it's got to end somewhere. And so they get to the place where the Schöner ground kind of comes to an end, which is almost like it's a small sort of marshy pass called the Lärchenbusch. They deploy some artillery there. They start bombarding the village of Kesselsdorf. And the Saxons are not very impressed by the bombardment. They think, if this is the best the Prussians have to throw at us, we're probably going to be okay. The Austrians, they have one grenadier battalion that maybe suffers a couple casualties from this bombardment. But the vast majority of the Saxon forces, the large collection of Saxon artillery pieces at the sort of northwestern end of the village of Kesselsdorf, because it's kind of one of these oblong villages that runs along a street, kind of flowing again, like so many other things in this battle, from the northwest to the southeast. So the guns, they're kind of at the end of the village. They continue firing back at the Prussians. The Prussians are not able to silence the battery. And so about 2 p.m., with the artillery bombardment not looking like it's being very effective, Prince Leopold orders his advance guard, consisting of some grenadier regiments, 3 grenadier battalions, Kleist, Blotho, and Munchau, to go and attack the fortified village position that the Saxons and 1 Austrian grenadier battalion have created at Kesselsdorf. These 3 grenadier battalions in the advance are supported, again, as I've already said, by one of the best regiments in 18th century Europe, certainly one of the best regiments in the Prussian army, the Anhalt regiment, which is Leopold's kind of like pet project, basically, in the Prussian army, trying to make these guys as effective as he can. And so, much like what we saw at the Battle of Soor, the Battle of Kesselsdorf begins with an assault by Prussian grenadiers and elite infantry on an enemy strong point, which in this case, much like the Battle of Soor, is a collection of large artillery pieces. And so one of the cool things about being a grenadier in the Prussian army is you're always sent to go get the enemy cannons. This is a very dangerous job, and it's a job that didn't turn out so well for those grenadiers at the Battle of Soor. Here at Kesselsdorf, the results are pretty similar. The first 3 grenadier battalions come in, and they are shattered by enemy fire. Not just from the canister being fired by the Saxon artillery pieces, but also by the small arms fire from the Saxon and the 1 Austrian grenadier battalion that's there as well. At this point, the brigade commander of this advance guard, General Hertzberg, he like Leopold Old Dessauer, is getting a little older. He's in his 60s. He draws his sword and he leads the Anhalt regiment forward. Well, much like the grenadiers, the 3 battalion strong Anhalt regiment comes up. They kind of get into relatively close range. They are sort of, for a moment, able to chase the gunners away from the artillery emplacement, the 20 or so guns that are bombarding them with canister. But under the small arms fire of the grenadiers that continue to kind of resist in the village, the advance falters. And in some ways, this is like the crisis point of the battle. Because there's a Saxon artillery officer who's like a general officer rank, named General Wilster, who at this point says, "Come on, grenadiers, let's launch a counterattack and retake our artillery positions." And so the Saxon grenadiers, the 1 Austrian grenadier battalion that's also there, they launch a counterattack to recapture the battery and push the Anhalt regiment kind of back, sort of down the hill into the ravine, away from Kesselsdorf. Then The other grenadier battalions, thinking, oh man, has an overall counteroffensive started? They begin to go on the attack. And so the attack just doesn't stop at the cannons. The Saxon grenadiers continue to sort of follow the Prussians down the ravine, and here they run into trouble. Because there's a whole wing of the Prussian cavalry that is kind of on their flank, and kind of directly near them, in addition to the Prussian soldiers who have kind of been repulsed or are continuing to fire at them. There's a large Prussian dragoon regiment, the Bonnen Dragoon Regiment, is like right there, that is ready to sort of begin a counterattack. And so, again, kind of just like what happened at Soor, where the Austrian grenadiers went sort of past their artillery, and, were eventually defeated by a Prussian counterattack, the same exact thing happens to these Austrian and Saxon grenadiers at Kesselsdorf. 5 or so battalions go forward. They gain some ground, certainly, but in the face of enemy infantry and especially enemy cavalry attacks from the Bonnen regiment, they end up getting pushed off the plateau and begin to retreat. And so there are a couple of Saxon grenadier battalions that don't take part in this attack, that are trying to kind of hold on to Kesselsdorf. But now a lot of the Prussian infantry is sort of reformed. In addition, some Prussian infantry from the main line of battle who weren't part of the advance guard, but particularly the Yietze regiment, they kind of go in and also attack the village of Kesselsdorf. And so, in a relatively short fight, people quibble about, is it 20 minutes, is it 30 minutes? So you have a relatively short fight. The Prussians are able to go in and maybe not fully master the village of Kesselsdorf, but have broken into the village, have the enemy, sort of battery is no longer kind of defending the village out in front of the village. The Prussians have taken this sort of westernmost flank position of the Saxon army. It's a real challenge and crisis point, and the rest of the kind of Saxon forces have to decide what they're going to do. Well, for the main line of the Saxon army, they're actually kind of in a slightly weird position, because the Prussian battalions besides for those under the command of Prince Moritz and the guys who are the kind of Yietze regiment that's going down to assist with the attack on Kesselsdorf, the Prussians are like waiting kind of like on their side of the Schöneground. They're not going down in and kind of beginning the attack. So this is kind of the second phase of the battle. So the Prussian forces, the Austrian and Saxon forces are deployed in a pretty solid position. To come through this ravine, to go out and sort of form up on the other side, in the face of enemy artillery and canister fire, in the face of enemy deployed infantry, it's going to be pretty challenging. And so it's almost like, it's a little glib, but it's kind of like a game of chicken to see who's going to come off of their positions and go off onto the attack. And in different sections of the battlefield, different things happen. Certainly there are Prussian units that go down into the Schönegrund, and maybe just come up right over the upper edge of the ravine and start firing at the Saxon army from that position. But near the village of Kesselsdorf, the Prussian infantry actually starts firing when they're a pretty long ways away from the Saxon positions. And they're firing with sort of platoon fire at a range of between 600 and 700 yards, which, if you know anything about 8th century warfare, it's a really, really long, distance. It's a really, really long way. There are a lot of lingering questions about how effective the fire would be if you fire from this distance. At the Battle of Mollwitz in 1741, the Prussians fired 800 yards, so it's something they maybe have a track record of doing. Here at Kesselsdorf, I think there's absolutely a reason for it. And they're trying to intimidate the Saxon infantry, and they're trying to get the Saxon infantry to do something, or maybe even the officers of the Saxon infantry to do something. And so General Demer, who is kind of commanding this brigade of Saxon infantry, who's kind of opposite the Prussians who are firing at them from long range, is almost kind of like excited that they're doing this. He's like, they're throwing away their fire at a really long distance. This is really great for us. And he kind of gives a big speech to the men and says, look, if you fire a musket at 700 yards away, if you get hit by the bullet, it's not even going to, sort of penetrate the coat. You're going to be fine. And so he argues that the right thing to do, now that the Prussians have thrown away their fire, you've got, the best volley you're ever going to fire in a battle in the 18th century is the first volley. When all the muskets are loaded, all the muskets have fresh flints, none of the muskets are fouled, especially in kind of wintry weather. And so General Demer decides we're going to go on the offensive now and march into, he hopes, within 50 or 60 paces of the Prussian infantry who are firing, and fire a volley ourselves and win this firefight and cause them to retreat. And so the Saxon infantry go forward, but as maybe listeners of this podcast and people who are familiar with my work generally hopefully already know, it's a really difficult psychological task for soldiers to go forward when they're under fire, even if that fire is not terribly effective, and not return fire themselves. And so what frequently happens is, kind of going down the line, the Saxon infantry don't hold their fire until they're within 50 or 60 paces and then attack with the bayonet. They plop down at like 300 yards and fire a couple of shots. And then it becomes very apparent that the Prussian fire is more disciplined, the Prussian fire is faster. It starts to look like to them, oh my gosh, we're losing the firefight, and their forces start to retreat. And so this is General Demer is not wrong. If his soldiers actually had gone to within 50 yards and fired a big volley at the enemy, the results probably would have been devastating, and the Saxons probably would have won the battle. But this is a difficult moment for the Saxon soldiers psychologically, and so as a result, they begin to kind of withdraw. They begin to go on sort of larger and larger numbers of kind of like the center left of the Saxon army start to go. And now it's turning from, like, we've lost at one position of the battle, but it's almost looking like there's like a panic that's starting to spread kind of down the line of the Saxon army. And this is going to be something that it's going to be increasingly difficult for the Saxon forces to overcome.
Awesome. So our Saxons are falling back. The steam in their attack on the Prussian line is kind of gone out. So what happens next?
Exactly right. So on the right side, if we move into phase 3, I guess we would say, on the right side of the battlefield from the Saxon perspective and the left side of the battlefield from the Prussian perspective, and it's like north-south, so we're just going to say the right side, there are several villages, kind of 3 villages. The first is on the far side of the Schönegrund, like on the other side of this ravine, on the northern side of this ravine, on the Prussian side of this ravine, and that's the village of Steinbach. Then, very close to the ravine on the southern side, you have the village of Sulmen. And then finally, kind of further to the rear, you have the village of Penrich. And the Prussians, kind of seeing the success on the west end of the battlefield or the left end of the battlefield, and increasingly the success in the center, 2 Prussian infantry brigades, the brigades of Bredau and von Kalnein, they begin to advance to try and push a little bit more pressure on the rest of the Saxon army. And there's some Austrians on this end of the battlefield as well, some cavalry squadrons that the Austrians have kind of deployed to help their Saxon friends. So the first thing that happens is the brigade of Bredau moves into the village of Steinbach and kind of takes possession of that village. And so now you have sort of Prussian soldiers who aren't just kind of like waiting on the other side of the ravine, but are kind of moving closer to you, have taken kind of a defensive position closer to you. The Prussians then decide, well, no one's coming up to get us. We should go on to the offensive, we should cross the Schönegrund, and we should take the village of Solman. And so the brigade of Bredau goes to take this village and takes Solman. There are Saxon infantry, specifically the forces under the command of a general named Haxthausen, moves up and tries to sort of contest this village. By this point, it's become pretty clear to the Saxon soldiers that they're not winning this battle overall, and so maybe they are not putting in maybe the entire 100% effort that General Haxthausen kind of hopes that they will. While this is happening, you have Prussian infantry in the kind of the adjacent brigade further towards the center of the battlefield, Kalnine. They go up and they plop themselves kind of like the other Prussians did just on the other side of the Schönegrund, and they kind of start firing from long range. And the remainder of the Saxon infantry tries to do the same thing. They try to launch a kind of a counterattack to kind of get into close range. Particularly, it's the regiment of Brühl who goes and tries to kind of get into close range and do this. They don't succeed. Their soldiers begin firing. They start retreating. Their retreat starts to cause a panic in the brigade that they're part of. They start streaming off the battlefield, and the entire sort of right flank of the Saxon army kind of collapses. And so what had started off as kind of like a fight for villages on one end of the battlefield, or fighting for control of Kesselsdorf, ends up being a sort of kind of terminated by a fight over possession over villages on the eastern end of the battlefield, the villages of Steinbach, the villages of Zulman. The Prussians are able to occupy these villages. The Saxon counterattacks are not able to sort of bounce them out. As a result, the Saxon army basically decides discretion is the better part of valor. They are continually hoping that they're going to see the first signs of Prince Charles of Lorraine's army kind of streaming onto the battlefield and kind of getting ready to help them. When that becomes apparent that we don't see any reinforcements, they decide that, maybe we're going to live to fight another day. Something I should have said earlier in the podcast, maybe we could reinsert this in the front somehow, is the Saxon generals and Saxon soldiers are laboring under the misapprehension that even though they probably outnumber the enemy by 1,000 or 2,000 men, they're actually 50,000 Prussians, and they only have 30,000 men. So they think they're outnumbered by a factor of almost a factor of 2 to 1. And so in many ways, it's not necessarily that the Saxons are bad soldiers, but the generals and the men are going into this battle with the assumption of not only does the enemy have a fearsome reputation, like they're Prussians, they've been winning a lot of battles in this war, but also we think the enemy army is huge compared to our army, which is more middling in size. This is a pretty powerful, psychological barrier to overcome, and as Andrew reminded us kind of at the beginning, probably the best part of the Saxon army is their cavalry. And that cavalry doesn't really play much of a meaningful role at all at the Battle of Kesselsdorf. They're in the third line, and by the time the infantry kind of start running from the battlefield, the cavalry are not, willing to sort of go in and change things up.
Dang. So that Saxon army, they end up retreating back to Dresden after that defeat?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of talking a little bit about the aftermath and about the casualties of the battle. Depending on who you believe, the Prussians take about 5,000 casualties in the course of this battle. So, still, if it's a 30,000 man army, that's like, pretty sizable chunk of the army. The Saxons take about 10,000 casualties, 9 or 10,000 casualties. A lot of those are POWs, guys who are sort of captured in the course of the flight by cavalry. As far as dead and wounded, the Saxons probably lose a pretty comparable number of men to the Prussians. So it's a pretty even fight on the battlefield itself. I mean, it shouldn't necessarily surprise us. I mean, if the Prussian tactic is assault the enemy artillery position with grenadiers and get shredded by canister, and then fire from really long range, you're not going to cause a huge number of enemy casualties. But these are tactics which end up winning the Prussians the battle, and they cause a lot of casualties and take a lot of prisoners in the course of the aftermath. And so with pretty great speed, the Prussian army is, they take a day to kind of reorganize themselves after the fight. But by the 17th of December, Leopold and Old Dessauer was at the gates of Dresden, basically saying, hey, let's surrender. Come on, guys. It's time to go. Which is, for 18th century terms, from winning a battle to, approaching the enemy capital city and demanding its surrender within, a day and a half, that's very impressive. This is a battle that, Alex Querengässer argues, has very quick, decisive turnaround results. A lot of battles in the 18th century, supposedly, are not very decisive. And so as a result of this, Kesselsdorf is a shining example of a battle that alters the balance of power in a war overnight and causes a major belligerent power to drop out of a war almost immediately. And so the results that Prince Leopold gains at Kesselsdorf are very, very quickly translated into overall strategic success. That is to say, Saxony drops out of the war, and with the Saxons gone, the Prussians are able to negotiate a peace with the Austrians in which they retain control of Silesia.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.